Welcome to Triads in Motion, episode 3. In this episode, we're going to look at Carcassi's Opus 60, number 15 study. And this study is a great extension of the concepts that we looked at in episodes 1 and 2. If you're just coming to this video, you might want to look at those other two for context, because I'm going to extract some ideas from the Carcassi, but also I'm going to reference some things that we looked at in the previous 2 episodes. So check those out to minimize frustration. So this first opening in this study involves what we could just call closed triad spacings. It's C, E, G, root position C major, and then he inverts the triads like this. Just a straight triad, root position, first inversion, second inversion, root position. And by the way, the PDF tab for this lesson is for sale at the link below, and you can also get the complete analysis in standard notation if this really interests you, so check that out. But what Carcassi does is really interesting. It's similar to what we were doing in the earlier episodes. He takes a voice, in this case the upper voice of these triads, and he systematically suspends them. So the first chord takes a 6/5 suspension. Second chord takes a 9/8 suspension, then a 4/3 suspension, and a 6/5 suspension. If you could have a lesson with Carcassi, I'm sure he would say that in addition to the arpeggio pattern, the purpose of this etude is really to teach this idea of inversions of 7th chords and triads, and then learning to put in these kind of diatonic suspensions. So I'll play this first phrase for you slowly. Little technique tip, if you want to, what you can do this last note before a shift, play it in the new position. It creates a little more phrasing continuity. Take a listen. So we have 6/5, 9/8, 4/3, 6/5 suspensions, all on a C chord. And then what Carcassi does is he moves to what you might call a B diminished chord over D, but it's really, you could think of it as a rootless G7 with a 4/3 suspension on it. And then that's kind of confirmed that we are in G7 because the next chord is a G7 chord over F with a 6/5 suspension. So we have back to the 1 chord, C major, this time with a 9/8 suspension. Then root position, 6/5 suspension. So the second half of that first phrase, we've got G7 over D is how I think of it. Then G7 over F, both with the suspensions on top, C major over E, and then C major, 9/8, 6/5 suspensions. Then we continue on, and in measure 5 we have, same as the opening, 6/5 suspension, 9/8, and now Carcassi moves to the 6th chord of the key, the A minor chord, and here the suspension is a flat 6 moving to 5 because F is diatonic to the key of C major, right? So then a first inversion A minor with a 9/8 suspension. Okay, then in measure 7, he goes to a D7 with without a fifth, there's a tritone up on top, and he plays a 4-3 suspension. And then we go to a D major triad up here with a 9/8 suspension, and that's actually the highest note in the piece. Back to G major. There's no third in this chord, but it's clearly a G major function, and there's a 9/8 suspension. So again, from measure 7, D7, no fifth, 4-3, D major with a 9/8 suspension, and then G major, no fifth, 9/8 suspension, and although G bass, we've cadenced now, it's a half cadence, and this is the end of the A section. All right, so sometimes what's really helpful is to just play the whole reduction and play them, the chords with the suspensions. And so what I'll do is I'll play this whole first A section, and I'll play first the chord with the suspension, and then I'll resolve the suspension like this. So that was a 6-5, here's a 9/8. 4-3, 6-5. Here we have the 4-3, 6-5, 9/8, and 6-5. Now, 6-5 again, same start, 9/8. But now he goes to A minor with the 6-5 and the 9/8 suspensions, D7 with the 4-3, D major with the 9/8, fifthless G major chord, 9/8 suspension, and G. So this is your shorthand version. In the second half of this piece, he begins on a root position closed G major chord, and the way I think of this is that we are now in G major, or my ear says G major now. So because what happens is G major with a 6-5 suspension. If you like to play it on just 3 strings, that's one way, but you could play it on 4 strings, which has a little charm too. And then from G major, he goes to D7 with no fifth, and he suspends, he does a 9/8 suspension on this chord. So back up to this kind of tritone with the 8-7 motion. In measure 11, he goes back down to D7 over F sharp, 9/8 suspension, drops the bass to the root, 9/8 suspension, and in measure 12, we're on G major again, 6-5 suspension. But he revoices the G major up here with a 4-3 suspension in the second half of measure 12. So measure 12 is 4-3. Now, we're back to G major with no fifth. 9/8. F major over A. 9/8. And now, what is, if I said we're in the key of G major, what the hell is a G sharp doing there? The G sharp is an indication that maybe we have a secondary dominant or secondary function happening. Let's investigate it. So we've got G sharp, D, and E. This would be like a fifthless E7 chord. E7 over G sharp. In the second half of bar 15, he puts that root in there, the bass confirms it. Now what's interesting about measure 15 is that the suspensions, the 9/8 and 6/5 suspensions, because we're in the key of G now, and we're moving to the 2 chord A minor. This E7 harmony is a secondary dominant. It's a 5-7 of 2, E7 going to A minor, which is the 2 of our new key, G major. Very often in this style, and earlier styles too, when you have a dominant chord moving to a minor chord, very often the 9th is flatted, and the 6th would be flatted as well if it were present as a suspension or something. So that's what happens in this case. You've got an E7 chord over G sharp, and the F is the flat 9. So then the 6th is a flat 6 that embellishes the second half of bar 15. And then now we have a different spacing. See, so far in episodes 1 and 2, we looked at drop 2 chords only. Carcassi's mixing all of these different voicings for triads. He's got closed spacings in here. He's got double dropped spacings, drop 2, drop 3, double drop 3. I don't think it's super important to label every single spacing, but it is interesting to note how he's sort of expanding and contracting the compass or the range of the music, and how that does really give a feeling that maybe the music is becoming more dramatic, if it's becoming more contained. It's sort of just like modulating the emotion of the piece a bit with that spacing. In bar 16, he's got A, E, C. That's an A minor chord in open spacing. And he puts a 4-3 suspension on this chord. And then he goes back to this, which is an incomplete triad. It's A, C, A, right? But it has a 9-8 suspension on it. This is the second half of bar 16. Let's play measures 15 and 16. Take a listen. And see, knowing what the chords are and knowing where the suspensions are is what allows me to have a sense for which parts of the harmony need a little bit more stress, which kind of brings logic to the piece, but it also brings a little bit of more emotional intensity to the resolutions of the harmony. Okay, so we've looked at the up to bar 17. Let's look at 17. Here we've got a D7, which we would think of as the 5 chord now, because we're thinking that we're in the key of G. He plays a 4-3 suspension on that chord. Then we have a D sharp diminished, which, without going too deep into the weeds here, you could think about this chord as a B7 flat 9 over D sharp, because it's moving to E minor, which is now the 6th chord. So we saw a 5-7 flat 9 of 2, and now we're seeing a 5-7 flat 9 of 6 in the key of G. I sometimes like to think that way because if I think about diminished, it's just a lot of extra thinking. If I think about how they function as really dominant chords. So a D sharp diminished chord kind of functions as a B7 flat 9, flat 13 if you like. And where would that go? To E minor, and it does go to E minor. It goes in bar 18, we have an open spacing for E minor with a 4-3 suspension. That's bar 18. So we have, here's 17. 18, 4-3 suspension. Now I'm choosing to call this chord A sharp diminished. So that would make the F sharp a 6-5 suspension. And then G major over D, 6-5 suspension. fifthless G major, 9/8 suspension. In measure 21, we're back home. C major, just like the opening. 6/5. No, I choose to think of this as C7. Again, it's the 8 flat 7, the root flat 7 shaped on that chord. Then here A7 with a flat 9. Actually, it's just an A major triad with a flat 9. Going to what could be thought of as a thirdless A7. Again with the 8 flat 7, going to D minor, 4, 3, and so forth, right? So I think we've probably covered enough of this piece at this point for you to have a concept of what's really going on here. And you can see how great this is to study the concepts we've been looking at so far in the series. You've got various types of spacings here, and we're going to go in depth with each type of spacing throughout the series. I've only really outlined drop 2, but through learning this study, you'll pick up a lot of other spacing ideas. And then he persists all the way through the study, just inverting that upper voice. Suspending that upper voice, right? So he's going through each inversion of all of these beautiful progressions, but he's keeping that suspension happening. And he's so interested in the motivic kind of integrity of that sometimes he'll just choose to do 2 chord tones instead of a suspension and a chord tone, as we saw in some of these examples. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, then definitely check out the PDF and the tablature in the PDF. It'll be really helpful. And I think one thing we will do for sure in upcoming episodes is look more systematically at retardations, which is sort of it's like a suspension upside down, if you like. It's a non-chord tone that resolves upward. Later, we're going to look at combining the suspensions and the retardations to create enclosures. And then at that point, your thinking is going to become so fluid with the triads and the possibilities in each voice that you should be able to take away maybe just the progression of something like this Carcassi, but create your own kind of realization of the harmony. A thing you could do if you wanted to do that with this piece is you could take this study, learn all of these block chords, without suspensions. And instead of doing what Carcassi did, which is suspend the upper voice, you could suspend the middle or lower voices, right? You could play through that whole progression just suspending the inner voice. Take a listen. We might have to change the arpeggio pattern, but we could do. There I would play a G to F in the inner voice, so that would be that 8/7 thing, which is not really a suspension, but it keeps the pattern going. Here, you'd play an A, like 9/8 suspension. And then 6/5, 4/3. So you could have an arpeggio pattern that emphasizes those. You change the pattern to maybe go something like that, and you get this sense of the resolution of all of those suspensions in the inner voice through the Carcassi, right? So I imagine that Carcassi would have suggested that sort of exercise to more advanced students. Once they learn to play something like this, it's like, okay, now take this whole study and suspend, have that motivic kind of suspension in the other voices. And once you can do that with all 3 voices, then you can start to freely mix them, right? And at that point, you're creating spontaneously your own composition on the framework that Carcassi's established here I think that's enough for today. See you next time.